Europe is going through a crisis like it has not experienced since 2010 with the sovereign debt crisis. Well, let's be more precise. Here I am talking specifically about the Eurozone. That is to say, the subgroup of 19 countries within the European Union that use a common currency. These are the nations in orange on this map. The generalized rise in prices on the old continent requires the ECB to stop buying assets on the markets and to increase key interest rates in a radical way to slow down the economy and thus try to progressively curb inflation. To put it very simply, the amount of money in circulation, liquidity, must be reduced in order to slow down the rise in prices. Today, there is too much money chasing too few goods. However, Christine Lagarde, president of the ECB and head of the Euro's monetary policy, does not seem to be in a hurry to implement these actions. This is what she said to a journalist a few weeks ago.
How do you get it?
It will
back?
come. It will come. In due course. Yeah.
How?
In due
How?
course, it will come.
Yeah?
No,
But do you
because I
sleep
will-
at night when you see this?
Of course, I have to sleep at night. And I have to worry every morning. Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Well, if she sleeps, well, that is the main thing. We are reassured, but in the meantime, the house is burning. In fact, it has very little room to maneuver, and she's not going to shout that from the rooftops. The ECB finds itself in an extremely delicate position, between a rock and a hard place. Between the countries of the north, with for example Germany, Luxembourg, Holland or Finland, and the countries of the south, like Spain, Italy, Greece or France. This graph, which shows the intra-European balance of payments and is often used to analyze the trade balances of the Eurozone countries, clearly shows that a huge gap has opened up between these two groups over the past 10 years. On the one hand, you have the northern countries with a surplus trade balance. That is, they export more than they import, so they get richer. They earn more than they spend. And then, on the other hand, you have the southern countries with a deficit trade balance. That is, they import more than they export, so they get poor. They spend more than they earn. And when you spend more than you earn, well, automatically you go into debt. It's oversimplified, but it's not far from reality. And it brings us to this second graph, showing the level of debt of European countries according to their GDP. We find quite well the two groups we just talked about. Well, especially the southern countries in red on this map, having from now on a national debt higher than 100% of their GDP. And therein lies the problem for the ECB. The northern countries of the Eurozone are asking it to act on interest rates and to slow down or even stop the purchase of assets on the markets to fight inflation, directly impacting the rich German or Dutch pensioner who sees his savings melt away like snow in the sun. Because yes, the wider the gap between interest rates and inflation, the faster the depreciation of the currency. On the other hand, southern countries like Spain, Italy, and France have completely different needs. The latter are begging the ECB to do everything possible to keep rates as low as possible, because given their respective debt levels, a rise in rates, even by a few points, would suffocate them. If we take the case of France, for example, with a debt of about 3 trillion euros, if the rates were to rise from 0 to 3%, which would not even be enough today with the current inflation, but let's take this increase of 3 points for our example. It would mean that France would have to pay an additional 90 billion euros per year. So this would not be done immediately because it takes time for the current debt to mature and be replaced by debt at 3%. But in less than 7 years, all the debt will have been updated, if I may say so. 90 billion is the budget of the French national education system, with its 1 million civil servants, plus the defense budget. In short, it is simply not tenable. That said, the European Central Bank has recently stopped these debt purchases, and even reduced its balance sheet, which instantly triggered a reaction. Interest rates within the Eurozone are diverging, something that caused the 2010 crisis, as you may recall. On this graph, you can see the spread, i.e. the difference between Italian rates and German rates, and this is not good at all, coupled with inflation and the risk of a recession. The ECB has therefore once again called on the solidarity of the rich to support the countries of the South in serious trouble, but the Germans do not seem very enthusiastic. Anyway, if you want more information on what is happening in the Eurozone, I recommend you watch this video. But to sum up, the situation in which the Eurozone shares a common currency is relatively bad. So you might ask, what does this have to do with Bitcoin and crypto? Well, if the euro is imploding Europe because of tensions and deep disagreements on the monetary policy to adopt, how can we reasonably think that one day all the nations of the world will use the same currency as some Bitcoiners suggest? The famous hyper-Bitcoinization? Are we not witnessing the limit of such a system? Is it really realistic to want all nations to use Bitcoin as their currency? Well, that's what we'll see in this video. Come on, let's go. In the introduction, we spoke of the complicated situation in which the Eurozone currently finds itself. But before going any further, we must recall the initial objectives of this common currency project. In 1990, at the request of the European Commission, chaired at the time by the Frenchman Jacques Delors, the Emerson Report was drawn up, explaining all the benefits that the adoption of a single currency in Europe could bring. The economists supporting the initiative at the time explained that the euro could eliminate intercurrency exchange fees within the Union, promote trade and exchanges between member countries, create an area with common interest rates, so technically it's called debtor indistinction, which means basically that if you use the euro, it doesn't matter if you're Germany or Greece, you borrow at the same rate. That's what caused problems very quickly, because the market doesn't see, for example, the Netherlands and Spain with the same risk of default. So those two countries should have different rates. This difference in rates within the Eurozone, also known as the spread by experts, is giving the ECB nightmares. Let's continue. The report also mentioned that having a common currency could help to fight against the hegemony of the dollar and, above all, federate the European nations. This is the famous phrase of Jacques Rueff, a senior civil servant and French liberal economist who said that Europe will be monetary or it will not be. The euro was a way to bring the nations together. And yes, the same flag, the same currency. These are strong symbols that should in theory unite the peoples and make them feel European. Following the Second World War, politicians are looking for a way to prevent such horrors from happening again. And it is all to their credit. Since that time, the ambition to create a political and economic Europe has been going on in people's minds with great strength. So that was for the positive points. But 30 years later, we see that the reality is quite different, unfortunately. Taking a currency and applying it by force to a group of countries that have nothing to do with each other is not the idea of the century. In order to understand why the euro is having trouble functioning, we need to go back to the usefulness of variable exchange rates. If you have control over your currency, you can decide to devalue it to favor exports and limit imports, and thus regain a trade balance in surplus, or at least in balance. This is what Erdogan seems to want to do in Turkey, for example. When the economy of your country is bogged down, you can choose to destroy your currency, and therefore the savings of your population to revive the economic fabric. And yes, if your currency loses 50% of its value against the euro, for example, then all the products you produce locally are twice as cheap for a French or Spanish person. You become extremely competitive and interesting on the international trade scene. This will boost tourism, your exports, as well as foreign investments on your soil. On the other hand, automatically all the imports you need are more expensive. If your currency is worth 2 times less, the barrel of oil you buy in dollars abroad is worth 2 times more, which could increase the price of goods and services in your economy. This can be called imported inflation. Now, as the export selling price is equal to energy plus raw material plus labor plus a margin, you can double the cost of energy and possibly raw materials while remaining competitive. In short, playing with the price of its currency is a perilous exercise because the impacts are multiple and everything does not necessarily go as planned. China, on the other hand, has played the devaluation game very well for the last 40 years by forcing the devaluation of its yuan. It has condemned a generation of Chinese workers to earn much less than they could have. But this sacrifice was made by the government because they bet that Westerners would prefer to export their factories to produce in China rather than put tariffs on them to keep their industrial fabric. The Chinese took the bet that the Westerners would give them their factory out of laziness, in a way, and it worked. The Chinese agreed to work against the debt in dollars, the value of which they have no illusions about. But in exchange, they got back the low and middle range economic fabric of the USA and part of Europe. China is the first economic power in the world today. Bet 1.
A great success!
The devaluation of a local currency is a bit like a nationwide sale decided unilaterally by the government. By devaluing your currency, it is a kind of forced Black Friday on a national scale. And we come back to the Eurozone. This graph is very interesting. You can see on the upper part in red the Italian industrial production since the mid-70s, and in blue, the German one. In the lower part in red, it is still the Italian production, but in black, it is the exchange rate between the German and Italian currencies. We can see that from the end of the 70s until the beginning of the 2000s, Italian production followed German industrial production perfectly. Basically, Italians and Germans produced more or less the same thing in terms of quantities. On the other hand, as you can see on the lower part and the black curve, the Italian lira was constantly losing value against the German Deutschmark. So absolutely, Germany was getting richer than Italy. But our Italian counterparts were at least managing to keep their economic fabric. That is, their factories, their production, their jobs. From 1999 and the arrival of the euro, everything changes. You can clearly see a change of trend on the upper part of the graph. The Italians can no longer compensate for their lack of efficiency and productivity by devaluing the currency, which they had been able to do until then during the recessions of the last few years, the shaded areas on the graph. The consequence is immediate. The Italian consumer starts to buy German because the currency allows him to do so, and Italian production falls. The country is de-industrializing because it is no longer interesting in the face of competition. Of course, you could answer that the Italians had or have to work harder, be more productive, or more creative instead of constantly devaluing their currency. Yes and no. It is a political choice that is not obvious. One can prefer to spend more time at the beach and have a slightly worse car. When you think about it, optimization for optimization's sake is not rational. Italians and Germans are two distinct peoples living in very different climates. It may sound like a cliché, but you don't want to work as much when you're on the Italian Riviera as you do in the Bavarian fog. This may seem like a clumsy joke to you, but the Montesquieu is a great liberal, already identified in his time the climate as one of the most important factors in the construction of a society. And I quote, "It is the different needs in the different climates that have formed the different ways of living, and these different ways of living have formed the various kinds of laws." In short, a German and Italian do not live the same way and do not have the same aspirations. As soon as the euro was implemented, the plan was for the Italians in the countryside to work 42 hours a week to fight against the German competition that threatened them directly. Unluckily, the Italians in the factories did not receive the memo, or simply did not want to work 42 hours a week despite all the plans of the Eurocrats in Brussels. And now you are going to tell me that in France, between rich and poor areas, it's a bit the same, isn't it? So why does it work in France and not in Europe? The technical answer is that France has organized a budgetary solidarity. Basically, the rich regions send money to Corsica every year. As a result, social peace is preserved, what the Germans don't want to do with the Italians. Playing with the exchange rate of your currency allows you to balance your trade budget. It is this balance that brings a certain stability between economies. If you import more goods than you export, devaluing your local currency will normally bring things back into balance. And yes, once again, if your currency loses 50%, all of a sudden you will be able to export your production more easily, but also reduce your imports, which now cost twice as much. If you don't have the possibility to press this button, your situation only gets worse. And this is what we saw in the introduction, this famous gap between the countries of the North and the countries of the South. On the one hand, the first group has an increasing trade balance surplus, while the second group has an increasing trade balance deficit, and the gap is growing. Nothing seems to be able to stop the trend. And many economists, like Charles Gove, for example, believe that this is largely due to the fact that all these countries use the same currency and therefore no longer have the possibility of playing with exchange rates to rectify the situation. Now some of the followers of Austrian economic theories will tell me that manipulating money is opening Pandora's box. Every time people have had the power to create money, they have abused it at one time or another, and the result has always been the same. The money in question has collapsed. Voltaire said this already in the 18th century. Paper money, based solely on trust in the government that prints it, always eventually returns to its intrinsic value, which is zero. We are therefore faced with the dilemma. On the one hand, being able to manipulate your currency to help your local economy. But with this option, you have a significant risk that at some point, human greed will push those in power to take advantage of the system to enrich themselves at the expense of the collective. And the second option is to have no control over your currency and let the market decide your fate. The hard law of nature. The most efficient and productive countries will survive. The others will disappear or be forced to change their ways to catch up with the leaders. Basically, work hard or die. Walk or die. In my opinion, it is not one or the other, but a combination of both. It seems interesting to have a system that can rebalance inequality continuously and not at the end of the cycle, which inequality is too high. Indeed, when inequalities are too great and a small group of individuals holds all or almost all the wealth, it becomes unbearable to live together. Wars and revolutions break out. These are the famous jubilees. Debts are canceled. We start again at zero. The concept does not really date from yesterday. Here's what is written, for example, in the Old Testament. You shall count 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7 years, that is, 49 years. In the 7th month, on the Day of Atonement, you shall sound the trumpet throughout all your land. And you shall consecrate the 50th year as holy, and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all the inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you, when each of you shall return to his property, and each of you shall return to his clan. Richard and Anise talked about it very well in this video. A divergent system does not work. At some point, the difference in potential is too great, and nature comes in to balance things out. A bit like lightning, and it's better not to be around at that moment. This makes me wonder about the feasibility of the dream that some Bitcoiners sometimes describe, hyper-Bitcoinization. Having Bitcoin used everywhere and by everyone in the next few decades. Wouldn't such a monetary policy definitely condemn the more troubled countries to poverty and chaos? Until the situation becomes too unbearable and everyone starts to split up? Bitcoin as a common world currency could eventually be possible if we all spoke Esperanto, if we had a common culture, if there were no borders and we could all move freely from one place to another according to our preferences, if we had a global fiscal, social, and budgetary policy. Basically, if we were all inhabitants of planet Earth and not residents of a particular country, with its own history, culture, social morals, etc. If there is too much difference, it doesn't work. As we see in Europe, you need homogeneity for a common currency to work. The United States is a good example. 50 federated states in a relatively coherent economic zone. This is the basis on which the dollar has been able to develop. The Eurozone states, on the other hand, have stopped in the middle of the road to economic integration. Why did this happen? Because Germany, France, Spain, or Italy never really wanted to lose their national sovereignty at the expense of a Central European power. It is a choice, neither good nor bad, but it is fundamentally incompatible with the common currency. So to me, the euro is doomed, and it seems relatively wise to convert your wealth into a more reliable store of value, and to put as much distance as possible between your money and the government of the Eurozone countries that are currently in deep trouble and will probably take extreme measures in the coming months and years. There is no doubt that these monetary issues are extremely complex. The purpose of this video was not necessarily to give a clear and precise answer, but rather to think together about the advantages and disadvantages of such a system, and to see how they could complement each other to create something really effective. Fiats are evil. Bitcoin, the good, is in my opinion a very simplistic conclusion of reality. The current system is sick. Yes, that is a fact. Now, we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's a bit like condemning the concept of the family by looking at a couple where daddy hits mommy. The problem with the current fiat model is not the debt currencies per se, but the corruption. Instead of wanting to eradicate fiat currencies, we need to think about how to manage them better. And this is where Satoshi Nakamoto's invention could be interesting. Bitcoin could help clean up the international monetary system by restoring a countervailing power, a wake-up call for governments around the world. Indeed, Bitcoin's wide accessibility will theoretically allow anyone to take refuge in it if the local currency is poorly administered. This optionality and competition could completely change the game. Bitcoin could be the missing technological brick in the creation of a new international monetary system, a Bretton Woods 4.0. But we'll tell you more about all this in the next video. This one is busy enough as it is. See you next week for part 2. Until then, take care of yourself. Ciao.
Thank you so much for watching. If you like my videos, please subscribe and don't forget to hit the bell if you want to be notified of the next episode. And if you want to invest in the stock market over the long term or diversify your financial portfolio, I'm offering you an analysis of the 8 European star stocks to have. Thanks again for watching and have a great day.